Next, I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Donald Hertzmark. Donald Hertzmark is an adjunct professor in global electricity markets at Johns Hopkins University. He's an international energy specialist with more than 25 years of experience in oil and gas economics and analysis. He has worked for governments, private companies, state enterprises, international organizations in more than 90 countries worldwide to assess markets and projects, provide counsel for energy sector restructuring, design and evaluate energy programs and projects. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Hertzmark.
Thank you, Sandy, and I have the frequent flyer miles to prove that. I wanted to start with a little story from my past working in the renewable energy business, which was a long time ago. I was working on a large study of the U.S. economy, and I was the one who every day coordinated the sources and uses of energy. And so we were getting to the transportation energy, and it turns out that the numbers just weren't working out. We were using too much oil in transportation. And so the guy who was in charge of the study said, look, Hertzmark, you're just going to have to get rid of pickup trucks and vans. That's the only way this will work. Same people are still after pickup trucks and vans, which ought to tell you something. The reason may have changed, but basically, apparently pickup trucks and vans just need to be out of the picture. I wanted to start in this discussion of the economics and policy aspects of treaties in just going over a little bit of the area, but perhaps from a slightly different perspective of how our energy use compares to what we get from what's heating up this room right now. Every day, the usable solar energy that we receive on Earth, this is not the stuff that's bounced back into space, but basically what drives the weather and photosynthesis, is about 300 billion barrels of oil equivalent. All human fossil fuel energy use is about 220 million barrels of oil equivalent. Oil is about 85 million barrels per day. So we have a disparity of more than 1,000 between what we get from the sun and what we use on the Earth. It is very important to keep this in mind because this is really one of the factors that drives a lot of our policy. So changes in energy use that we can make with fossil fuels are so small relative to what we get from the sun that, as a number of people have pointed out on the more physical side of the forcing, it makes one somewhat skeptical about how much we would have to reduce energy use in order to actually affect whatever part of the climate is affected by our use of energy. Switching now to I'll put on my economist hat, switching to the economic perspective. In looking at these issues over 25 years or so, what I have found is that all over the world, and in these 90 countries or so where I have worked, people have moved or want to move from expensive, scarce, dirty, diffuse sources of energy to more effective, less costly, more abundant, cleaner, and more concentrated forms of energy. It only makes sense. If you think about why we still love oil, we love oil because it's concentrated, because a little package of oil in your gas tank can do a lot of work. A package of wood that size will not get you from here to Washington, D.C. in any degree of comfort. So this is the arc of development. Whale oil, for your information, in 1860 in this city sold for $2.50 a gallon. That would be something like $15 or $18 a gallon in today's prices. So even more expensive than some of these bandits down here who have very well located filling stations. Better technology, which is what we have developed, makes greater use of energy more feasible. If those of you who've been able to hear the work or hear or read Robert Bradley talk about this, talk about the increasing sustainability of fossil energy use. Consider the smart car in an era of expensive liquid fuel. Gasoline is expensive, parking is expensive. The mayor of New York wants to charge you $8 to drive below 59th Street pretty soon. So you leave your SUV at home because it costs a lot of money to use it every day. So you don't use a lot of gasoline. You use the subway system here. But if you buy a smart car, which, after all, you can park any place, maneuvers in traffic pretty well, still has air conditioning, and uses a third or a quarter the fuel your big car uses, you say, well, you know, I'm going to take that little trip over here, and I'm going to take that little trip downtown, and all of a sudden you're using more gasoline. How many of you have CFLs at home? When you walk into a room and you turn on the light, you turn on your CFL, you turn the light off as soon as you leave the room? No, because you've been told that you have to leave the CFL on for a while in order for it to get up to proper operating temperature. So if you leave it on, if you were going to walk into the room, find whatever you were going to find, walk out of the room and turn off the light, and instead you leave it on for the next 12 hours, I can guarantee you your CFL is using a lot more electricity than you were going to use with your incandescent bulbs. This is just one of the ways that more efficient appliances lead us to use more energy because it's more easy to do it. My wife comes from the tropics, and when we had old, inefficient furnaces and the price of gas was low, she used to walk around the house in the winter wearing sweatpants and a sweatshirt. And about 8 years ago, we got pretty much state-of-the-art gas furnaces and better insulation and windows. And does she walk around the house in the winter in sweatpants and a sweatshirt? No, she walks around in running shorts and a t-shirt because the temperature in the house is now about 5 or 6 degrees higher. It allowed us to use more energy inside the house, maybe burn less energy in the furnace, but more inside the house. This goes on all over the world. This is part of the increasing sustainability of fossil energy. And I want to switch now to talk about what all of this means, this energy economics means for Kyoto. But first, a few rules of economics I've learned over the years. Don't try to make people do things that aren't in their self-interest. I think anybody who's worked as an economist knows that it's very difficult to make water flow uphill. And if you try to make people do things that they don't want to do, you will have to either put a gun to their heads or bribe them. People don't want to go backwards. People don't want to go back to wearing sweatpants and a down vest inside their own houses in the winter. My grandparents grew up like that in Russia. They didn't like it either. You have to move along the arc of history with better technology and better fuels, and you have to understand the industry you're trying to regulate, and you have to understand the resources. That gets us back to the initial discussion about how much solar energy there is, how much fossil fuel there is. You have to have, we don't need physicists in all our policy positions, but people ought to have some fundamental understanding of the physical quantities. So what does all of this have to do with the Kyoto Protocol? Well, what is the Kyoto Protocol based on? It's based on two elements of policy. One is exhortation. The last time we had exhortation here was Jimmy Carter telling us about how energy was the moral equivalent of war, and we had to conserve energy because it was morally right. And it's also based on the cap and trade, which can work if you do it correctly, but Kyoto Protocol, as it has been implemented in Europe, used a cap and trade system that was based on faulty data. And what this meant was that for years, European industry was trading non-existent emissions reductions with each other. So they had a lot of activity, but they didn't actually reduce emissions. And I'm going to give you some information now which will bolster that. There was also a significant element I think of cynicism in the choice of baselines that our European allies used for the Kyoto emission reductions. So there's been a lot of talk over the years about how evil the US is, how good the Europeans are because they all signed on to Kyoto and we rejected it. And the EU as a whole only increased its CO2 emissions by 2.3% between 1997 and 2005. In contrast, the US increased its CO2 emissions by just over 7%. But almost all of that differential, in fact, more than that differential, came from shutting down the heavy polluters and the inefficient economies of the Eastern European countries that joined the EU, where, remember, in the old Soviet bloc, industrial policy consisted mostly of taking raw materials and burning them up, and so shutting these industries down increased energy efficiency tremendously, and the UK, which put most of its coal industry to bed during the 1990s. And finally, there was a significant increase in the wind output from Denmark, which is probably the only member of the EU that has some kind of legitimate decrease in its CO2 output. There were 5 countries in the EU that actually, in the old EU, I should say, members before the Eastern European countries joined. 5 countries had reductions in the 97 to 05 period. In all cases except for Denmark, this reduction was because 2005 happened to be an unusually warm winter. I went to the Finland meteorological website to check on this, and they weren't sure whether this was an anomaly or whether this meant that the apocalypse had arrived. But I think if you're Finnish, actually warm weather in the winter is nirvana, not apocalypse. But in any event, it came from 5 countries and a weather anomaly. Emissions reductions for the entire EU were non-existent. The old EU, the members before the former communist countries joined, increased their CO2 emissions by 8.5%, about 1 percentage point more than the US. It was an annual rate of a little over 1% during the period, and here are some highlights. Austria was up 23%, Greece was up 14%, Italy was up 11%, Ireland was up 28%, France was up 9%, even with all the news. USA was up 7%. We're not in the EU, but we look pretty good compared to most of the old EU countries. The Netherlands, even in spite of the windmills, up 14%. Norway, up 26%. Portugal, 25%. Spain, 44%. Australia, to go to some non-EU countries, Australia went up 24%. China was up 73%. So I think we can say, in all of these, in these countries in general, there was economic growth. China increased its emissions a lot because its economy increased in output a lot. And emissions represent the strength of the underlying economy. So there should be some relationship between what happens to the economy and what happens to carbon dioxide emissions. And indeed, this is true. In the old EU countries, the rate of growth per year from 97 to 2005 was about 2.1%. In the US, it was just about 3%. But we got a lot more economic growth for our CO2 than they did. In fact, we got about 50% more economic growth per unit of CO2 than the old EU countries did, indicating that, in fact, the economy of the United States, in the terms that Kyoto wants to define the environment, is becoming more efficient than the European economies, not less efficient. So what's the moral of this story? The moral of this story is that talk is cheap. And you can posture a lot and do a lot of name calling, but it doesn't result in emission reductions. Emission reductions, again, if you consider this important, emission reductions result probably from a couple of things, one of which is nuclear power, which is one of the great landmines of environmental policy. And it shows, because if nuclear energy were adopted at the same rate that natural gas were adopted in the United States, our total emissions of CO2 would have gone down since 1990 or so. In fact, wind, which is the reason Denmark could reduce its CO2 output, is only effective because they are tied to the Norwegian grid, which has water, which can instantly back up all these transients in the wind output. So what of the future? I was hoping to just end on a little story that guarantees you to, I know because I've done this, guarantees you to make sure that all your neighbors will never invite you over to dinner again, because they will say that this person is certainly unsound. There, we have on the bottom of the ocean these nodules of methane, frozen methane, called methane hydrates or clathrates. They are down there, and they freeze at a temperature above 32 F, mostly because of the pressure of the water. And the total resource of these methane hydrates is at least 1,000 times greater than known and probable reserves of natural gas, which are themselves extremely substantial. Now, methane is about 20 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than CO2. So, if you believe global warming orthodoxy, and you believe that the oceans are going to warm, then you believe that some of these methane hydrates are going to melt and degas. And this methane is going to come up to the surface, it's going to go into the air, and it's going to be extremely potent as a greenhouse gas. So, what should you do with this stuff? The moral imperative, if you are a true believer, is that we must immediately have a crash program to mine the seabed, pump this methane to the surface, and burn it in power plants, burn it in homes, turn it into liquid products that substitute for oil. These are the things that we must do if you believe the story. Now, this runs over a whole concatenation of no-nos in the environmental community. Mining the seabed, using high technology, using more energy rather than less. But if you believe that the sea is going to warm, these methane hydrates are going to melt, and this methane is going to hit the atmosphere, then this is something that we need to do. So, what does this mean about Kyoto 2? Kyoto 2 doesn't pay any attention to nuclear. It certainly doesn't pay attention to methane hydrates, and it will still exclude the most significant developing country energy users, India and China and Brazil, and we will still be buying bogus emission reductions from Russia and the former Soviet Union. So we can sign all the treaties we want. It will, as we have seen, signing the Kyoto Protocol doesn't guarantee anything in particular in terms of your emission reductions. With that, I would like to thank you very much. Bye-bye.
We are going to get